The golden glow of the bistro's interior cast a warm, amber light across the table, illuminating a $300 Wagyu steak that had barely been touched. Ronald Newsom sat in silence, his sharp blue suit reflecting the expensive polish of the room, while he mindlessly scrolled through market data on a device that cost more than most people earned in a year. Outside the thick, soundproof glass, the city was a different world entirely, a chaotic blur of rain-slicked pavement and biting winds that carried the scent of wet concrete and exhaust. Through the window, Ronald's gaze shifted from his steak to the street, landing on the familiar motionless figure standing near the curb. There she was, the girl in the olive jacket and the oversized tan beanie, her small shoulders hunched against the freezing drizzle as she clutched two empty white plastic bags. The contrast was a silent scream that Ronald had spent months learning to ignore. Inside, the air was climate-controlled and scented with truffle oil. Outside, the girl's breath hitched in small white puffs of vapor as the temperature plummeted toward freezing. He looked down at the marbled meat on his plate, rich and glistening, and then back at the child whose eyes remained fixed on the restaurant's heavy oak doors. She wasn't begging. She didn't approach the patrons or hold out a hand for spare change. She simply waited for the waste of the wealthy. A waiter approached, his movements fluid and differential, ready to clear the table. Ronald raised a hand, stopping him with a brief, sharp gesture that spoke of a lifetime of giving orders. "Pack it up," Ronald said, his voice as cold and sterile as his office. He watched as the pristine steak was slid into a white plastic container, the steam fogging the lid, turning a culinary masterpiece into a leftover. To Ronald, the transaction was a minor glitch in his routine, a small tax he paid to the conscience he rarely used. He took the bag, felt the heat through the plastic, and stood up, his leather briefcase in his other hand. As he stepped out into the night, the transition was jarring. The silence of the bistro was replaced by the roar of the city, and the wet slap of shoes on pavement. The girl, Lily, straightened her posture immediately, her eyes widening with a mix of relief and intense focus. As she saw the bag in his hand, she moved toward him with a strange formal politeness, her heavy boots splashing in the shallow puddles that mirrored the red and yellow lights of the passing traffic. "Good evening, Mr. Newsom," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the city. Ronald looked at her properly for the first time, really looked at her, and noticed the way her fingers, red from the cold, shook as she reached for the container. He handed it over, the white plastic bag crinkling between them. It was a moment of connection that lasted only seconds, yet tonight, the weight of the girl's gaze lingered. She added the steak to her other bags, which already seemed burdened with heavy items, and offered a small, solemn nod. "Thank you, sir. Be safe," she said, before turning and disappearing into the thickening fog of the alleyway. Ronald stood there, his expensive car idling just feet away, but he didn't move toward it. He watched the small, dark figure of the girl as she navigated the shadows, the white bags swinging like heavy pendulums at her sides. The luxury of the bistro was behind him, and the comfort of his penthouse lay ahead, but for the first time in his life, the path in between the one the girl was walking was the only thing that mattered. The following morning, the rain had stopped, but the chill remained, clinging to the floor-to-ceiling glass of the Newsom Capital headquarters. Ronald Newsom stood at the center of his corner office, a space of brushed steel and white marble that felt more like a vault than a place of work. To Ronald, the city below wasn't a collection of people, but a sprawling board of assets and liabilities, a machine he had mastered with clinical precision. He moved through his morning with the mechanical efficiency of the algorithms his firm pioneered, his mind already calculating the day's potential for growth. For Ronald, success was measured solely by the upward trajectory of a stock portfolio, a number that never reached a high enough ceiling to satisfy the void where his empathy used to be. "The acquisition is finalized, Newsom," his assistant, Sarah, said as she stepped into the room, her voice hushed to match the sterile atmosphere. She handed him a tablet, displaying the details of a manufacturing plant closure in the Midwest. Ronald didn't look at the names of the 300 employees who would be out of work by the end of the month. He looked at the projected 12% increase in quarterly dividend. To him, those 300 families were merely overhead, a line item to be trimmed to ensure the machine ran leaner. He signed the digital authorization with a flick of his thumb, a gesture that effectively dismantled a community's livelihood, without him ever having to look a single worker in the eye. His afternoon was a blur of high-stakes board meetings, where his sharp tongue became a weapon. Ronald prided himself on his truth, which was usually just a polite way of describing his total emotional detachment. When a junior analyst suggested that the firm consider a socially responsible investment fund with lower returns, Ronald's response was a surgical strike. He didn't raise his voice. He simply dismantled the young man's logic, until there was nothing left but embarrassment. He viewed human sentiment as a weakness, a glitch in the pursuit of profit, that clouded judgment and slowed down the inevitable march of progress. By 6:00 p.m., Ronald was alone again, the sun setting behind the steel skyscrapers that served as his only peers. He poured himself a glass of vintage scotch, the amber liquid catching the dying light, and felt the familiar hollow satisfaction of a productive day. He had increased his net worth by several $1 million, outmaneuvered a rival firm, and solidified his status as the city's most formidable financier. Yet, as he prepared for his nightly dinner at the bistro, the sterile perfection of his office felt suddenly stifling. He caught his reflection in the dark glass, a man in a perfectly tailored suit, who had everything yet possessed a heart as cold as the marble beneath his feet. He grabbed his briefcase, the leather smooth and cold, and headed for the elevator. His routine was his armor, a shield against the clutter of the sidewalks and the messy, unpredictable reality of human suffering. He had spent years building walls of glass and steel to keep the world at a distance, convinced that as long as the numbers climbed, he was winning. But as the elevator descended toward the street, a stray thought flickered in his mind, unbidden and sharp, the image of a heavy olive coat and a pair of trembling red hands waiting in the cold. He pushed the thought away, centering himself back on the only thing he believed mattered, the bottom line. The evening air outside the gilded plate was thick with a damp clinging mist that blurred the edges of the city's neon architecture. Ronald sat at his corner table, the familiar scent of expensive aged oak and roasting herbs failing to provide its usual comfort. Through the polished window, the street was a charcoal sketch of moving umbrellas and splashing tires, but his eyes were drawn to the same fixed point they found every night. Lily was there, positioned just beyond the reach of the restaurant's warm outdoor heaters, a small silhouette defined by the oversized olive jacket that seemed to swallow her whole. Dinner that night felt like a hollow performance. Ronald watched as the waiter placed a vibrant, seared tuna steak before him, accompanied by a reduction that cost more than the average worker's daily wage. Usually he would be checking the overseas markets on his phone, but tonight, his focus kept drifting to the glass. He watched Lily adjust her beanie, her movements stiff and slow. When the waiter returned to refill his wine, Ronald made the request almost before he had finished his second bite. He watched with a strange rising tension as the food was swept away to be packaged in the signature white bistro bag, scraps of a life he took for granted, soon to be handed over like a baton in a race he didn't realize he was running. When he finally pushed through the heavy oak doors, the cold hit him like a physical weight, but Ronald didn't retreat to the idling limousine waiting at the curb. He stood on the sidewalk, the bag of leftovers warm against his palm, and waited for the small girl to bridge the gap between them. As Lily stepped into the pool of light cast by the bistro's sign, the reality of her condition was no longer filtered through the glass. The olive jacket was even more frayed than he had noticed, its hem dark with the grime of the city, and her boots were cracked at the seams, soaked through by the evening slush. As she reached out for the bag, Ronald didn't let go immediately. For a brief suspended second, they both held the plastic handle, and in that proximity, he saw what the darkness usually hid. Her hands were not just red from the cold, they were skeletal,
the skin stretched tight over knuckles that trembled with an uncontrollable rhythm. She was thinner than she had been a week ago, her face pale and drawn, making her dark, soulful eyes appear impossibly large and filled with a weary wisdom that no 10-year-old should possess. "Thank you, Miss Newsom," she said, her voice a fragile rasp that barely rose above the hum of the nearby traffic. She pulled the bag toward her, adding it to the others she carried, and the sudden strain on her thin arms made her stagger. She caught her balance, her jaw tightening with a fierce, quiet determination that made Ronald's chest feel suddenly, inexplicably tight. He watched her turn away, her small frame leaning forward to compensate for the weight of the bags, her heavy boots dragging slightly on the wet pavement. For the first time, Ronald didn't just see a glitch in his routine or a recipient of his waste. He saw a child who was disappearing before his very eyes, yet carrying a burden that looked heavy enough to break a grown man. He stood frozen on the sidewalk long after she had vanished into the shadows of the alley, the cold finally seeping through his expensive wool coat and reaching his skin. The black sedan sat idling at the curb, a silent, gleaming beast that represented every comfort Ronald had ever known. His driver, a man named George who had been with him for a decade, stepped out to open the door, his hand already on the handle as he waited for Ronald to step inside. But Ronald remained rooted to the spot, his eyes fixed on the flickering shadows of the alleyway where Lily had disappeared. The weight of the world he had just seen in her eyes, the raw, shivering reality of her skeletal hands, had punctured the bubble of his expensive existence. For the first time in his life, the leather interior and the climate-controlled silence of his car felt like a cave. "Go home, George," Ronald said, his voice sounding foreign even to himself. The driver hesitated, his brow furrowing in confusion as he looked at his employer. Ronald was a man of absolute habit, a man who never deviated from a schedule. "Sir, it's freezing, and the rain is starting up again. Shall I wait for you?" "No," Ronald replied, his tone sharpening with a trace of his boardroom authority. "Take the night off. I'm walking." Without waiting for a response, Ronald turned his back on the luxury he had spent 40 years accumulating and stepped into the gloom. He didn't look back to see the confusion on George's face. He only looked ahead, searching for the olive drab coat that was currently the only thing anchoring him to a sense of purpose. The pursuit was not a simple stroll. Once he turned the corner, the polished facade of the main street crumbled into a labyrinth of narrow passages and neglected corridors. The air here was colder, trapped between towering brick walls that hadn't seen a cleaning crew in decades. Ronald's Italian leather shoes, designed for marble floors and plush carpets, slipped on the grease-slicked cobblestone. He felt the dampness immediately, a cold soak that seeped through the soles and chilled his ankles, but he pushed forward, guided by the rhythmic, heavy sound of Lily's boots echoing against the walls. He stayed 20 paces back, a shadow among shadow. He watched as Lily navigated the maze with a grim, practiced ease. She didn't look back, she didn't have the luxury of paranoia. Her entire being was focused on the weight in her hand. Ronald noticed how she shifted the bags every few yards, her small body tilting to one side to take the strain off her failing muscles. Every time she stumbled, Ronald felt a jolt of adrenaline, his hand reaching out instinctively as if to catch her from a distance. But she always righted herself, a tiny soldier in a war he hadn't known was being fought. They crossed out of the commercial district and into a part of the city Ronald usually only saw from the window of a helicopter. Here the streetlights were shattered, their glass sparkling on the ground like fallen diamonds in the mud. The neon glow was replaced by the flickering orange of trash fires in metal barrels. Groups of men huddled together in doorways, their eyes tracking the billionaire in the $5,000 suit. But Ronald didn't feel fear. He felt a profound, aching curiosity. The world was narrowing down to the back of that olive jacket. Lily turned a sharp corner into a dead-end street lined with rusted-out shipping containers and the skeletons of abandoned vehicles. Ronald slowed his pace, pressing himself against the cold, damp brick of a warehouse wall to remain unseen. He watched as she approached a heavy, corrugated metal door that looked as though it had been welded shut years ago. She reached into a hidden pocket of her coat, pulled out a heavy iron key, and struggled with the lock. Her hands were shaking so violently now that it took her 3 attempts to turn the mechanism. As the door creaked open, A sliver of dim yellow light spilled out onto the wet pavement. Lily stepped inside, the heavy bags dragging on the floor as she crossed the threshold. Ronald waited, his breath coming in short, visible bursts. Before he crept toward the door, he placed a hand on the cold metal, his heart hammering against his ribs, a sensation he hadn't felt since his first $1 million trade. He wasn't following a business lead or a stock tip, he was following the truth. He eased the door open just a few inches, peering into the cavernous, freezing interior of the warehouse, and prepared himself for whatever shock lay waiting in the dark. The transition from the world of glass towers to the world of broken windows happened with a sudden violent clarity. As Ronald stepped deeper into the district, the geography of wealth dissolved, replaced by the architecture of neglect. The skyscrapers that usually served as his North Star were now obscured by the jagged silhouettes of tenements, and the skeletal remains of long-dead factories. Here the air was thicker, heavy with the scent of damp charcoal and the metallic tang of rust. Every step Ronald took in his bespoke leather shoes felt like a transgression, the rhythmic click of his heels on the cracked pavement sounding like a countdown in the oppressive silence. He felt the weight of his navy blue suit like a suit of armor that had suddenly turned into a target. In the boardroom, this fabric commanded respect. Here, it was a glaring neon sign of everything this neighborhood lacked. He passed a row of abandoned storefronts, where the plywood coverings were scarred by layers of graffiti, the colorful tags acting as the only vibrant life in a landscape of gray brick. Through the gaps in the boards he could see the hollowed-out interiors of shops that had once served families, now reduced to piles of debris, and the scuttling sounds of hidden things. The streetlights above flickered with a dying, spasmodic light, casting long distorted shadows that seemed to reach for his ankles. Ronald watched Lily's small figure navigate this wasteland with the confidence of a ghost familiar with its haunt. She didn't flinch at the sound of a distant siren or the guttural shout of a man in a nearby alley. She simply adjusted the weight of the white plastic bags, and kept her head down. To Ronald, this was a descent into an abyss he had only ever seen as a statistical blip on a census report. To her, this was the way home. He realized with a stinging sense of shame that while he had been obsessing over the growth of his digital assets, an entire civilization of the forgotten was breathing and bleeding just blocks away from his favorite bistro. The physical decay of the environment began to mirror the growing unease in Ronald's chest. He saw a group of men huddled around a burning trash can, their faces illuminated by a flickering orange glow that made them look like ancient cave dwellers. As he passed, their conversation died, replaced by a heavy, suspicious gaze that followed the line of his expensive coat. For the first time in his life, Ronald Newsom felt genuinely out of place, not because of his status, but because of his ignorance. He had spent decades looking through the glass of high-rise offices and luxury cars, treating the world as a panoramic view rather than a lived reality. Now that the glass was gone, the air was cold, the ground was uneven, and the human cost of the city's progress was impossible to ignore. He nearly lost her when she ducked behind a row of rusted shipping containers that smelled of old oil and stagnant water. Ronald pressed his back against the cold corrugated metal, the grime of the city finally staining the pristine fabric of his suit. He took a breath, the icy air stinging his lungs, and peered around the edge of the container. The girl was standing before the heavy metal door of a massive derelict warehouse, the building's upper windows shattered like jagged teeth. As she struggled with the iron key, Ronald realized that the boundary between his world and hers wasn't just made of money, it was made of a silence he was finally determined to break. Ronald waited exactly 30 seconds after the heavy metal door groaned shut before he moved. Every instinct for self-preservation he possessed screamed at him to turn back toward the neon safety of the downtown district. But a deeper, more primal curiosity drove his hand to the cold iron handle. He pulled it just wide enough to slip through, the hinges letting out a high-pitched metallic weep that was swallowed by the cavernous silence of the interior. Inside, the warehouse was a cathedral of industrial decay. Massive steel beams reached up into a ceiling lost in shadow, and the air was several degrees colder than the street, smelling of wet concrete, stagnant oil and the faint biting scent of old rust. He moved with the stealth of a predator, though he felt more like a trespasser in a world he had no right to witness. The floor was littered with the debris of a forgotten era, shattered glass, rusted pulleys, and piles of rotting cardboard that forced Ronald to use each step with excruciating care. Far across the expanse, near the rear of the building where a few boarded-up windows allowed the distant city light to filter through in dusty gray shafts, he saw a flickering orange glow. It was small, no larger than a campfire, huddled against a brick wall that was blackened with. As he drew closer, the silence began to unravel into a chorus of soft, high-pitched voices. Ronald pressed himself behind a stack of wooden pallets, the rough timber snagging the sleeve of his $5,000 suit, but he didn't care. He leaned forward, squinting through the slats, and the breath left his lungs in a sharp, visible cloud. Lily wasn't alone. Surrounding the small, makeshift fire were 6 other children, the oldest perhaps 12 and the youngest no more than 4. They were wrapped in mismatched blankets and threadbare coats, sitting on old crates, or directly on the cold concrete. Lily was at the center of the circle, her heavy olive jacket still on, but her movements had shifted. The polite, formal girl Ronald met on the sidewalk had vanished, replaced by a tiny, stern commander. She was carefully unpacking the white plastic bags from the bistro with the reverence of a priestess handling sacred relic. The children didn't scramble or fight. They watched her hands with a desperate, disciplined hunger that made Ronald's stomach twist. He saw her pull out the Wagyu steak, his leftovers, and place it on a clean piece of cardboard in the center of their circle. Elijah, get the water. Sophia, make sure the blankets stay tucked around the little ones. Lily commanded, her voice no longer a whisper, but a firm, maternal anchor. She took a small, dull pocket knife from her coat and began to carve them. Ronald watched, mesmerized and horrified, as she divided the steak into 7 perfectly equal slivers. She didn't take the first piece. She didn't even take a large piece. She handed the slivers out one by one, watching as the younger children closed their eyes in brief ecstasy at the taste of high-end seasoning and rich fat. It was then that Ronald noticed the true extent of the family Lily had built. This wasn't just a group of runaways. It was a functioning unit, born of absolute necessity. In a corner, he saw a row of neatly arranged backpacks, likely filled with whatever school supplies they could scavenge. They were living in the skeleton of the city's past, hiding in plain sight, protected only by the sheer willpower of an 11-year-old girl who walked miles in the freezing rain to bring them the scraps of a billionaire's life. Ronald felt a sudden crushing weight in his chest, a realization that all his corporate victories were nothing compared to the daily triumph of survival happening in this freezing, hollow hall. He watched as Lily finally sat back, clutching a plastic cup of lukewarm water, her own portion of the food still sitting untouched on the cardboard as she watched the others eat first. The cold inside the warehouse was a physical presence, a heavy, airless pressure that seemed to sap the light from the small fire at the center of the circle. From his vantage point behind the splintered pallets, Ronald watched as Lily knelt on the concrete, her movements slow and deliberate. She had laid out a single sheet of clean parchment paper, likely salvaged from the bistro's packaging, and on it, she placed the Wagyu steak and a small side of roasted vegetables. In the dim, flickering orange glow, the food looked like a king's ransom. The other children leaned forward, their faces illuminated by the flames, their eyes wide and glassy with a hunger that was quiet and disciplined. Ronald felt a cold sweat break out along his spine as he watched Lily pull a small silver folding knife from her pocket. She didn't just cut the meat, she measured it, with the focus of a diamond cutter. She aligned the blade, marking the steak, into 7 identical strips. Her hands, though still trembling from the freezing trek through the city, became steady the moment the blade touched the surface. She was calculating the survival of her family in millimeters. Each slice was an exact replica of the last, ensuring that no one, not even the smallest 4-year-old, would feel the sting of a smaller portion. It was a display of mathematical precision that Ronald had only ever seen in high-frequency trading floors. But here, the stakes weren't billions of dollars. They were the basic calories required to see the sunrise. One by one she handed the portions out. She used the tip of her knife to slide the slivers of meat onto small plastic lids that served as plates. The children received their food with a hushed "Thank you, Lily," their voices sounding like a choir of ghosts in the vast echoing space. Ronald noticed that as each child began to eat, savoring the richness of the fat and the sear of the high-end seasoning, Lily's own hands remained empty. She had finished distributing the steak and the few stalks of asparagus, leaving only a few crumbs and a smear of Jess underpotch. She turned her attention to the second bag, the one containing basic groceries she must have purchased with the meager earnings from her odd jobs. She pulled out a single loaf of bread and a jar of peanut butter. Again the precision returned. She sliced the bread into thin translucent rounds, spreading a translucent layer of peanut butter over each. She was stretching the impossible, making a meal for 7 out of what Ronald would have considered a light snack. He watched her calculate the remaining bread in the bag, her lips moving silently as she budgeted for tomorrow's breakfast. It was the most ruthless and beautiful accounting Ronald had ever witnessed.
When the distribution was finished, and every other child had a small pile of food before them, Lily finally looked down at her own space on the floor. There was nothing left but a small crust of bread and a cup of water she had drawn from a dripping pipe in the corner of the warehouse. She picked up the crust, looked at it for a long moment, and then, without a hint of hesitation, she broke it in half and handed the pieces to the 2 youngest children, who were already looking longingly at the empty center of the circle. "Eat," she whispered, her voice cracking with a fatigue that reached into Ronald's soul. "I had a big lunch at school. I'm full." The lie was so transparent, so desperately brave, that Ronald had to turn his head away, his forehead resting against the rough cold wood of the pallets. He thought of his own dinner, the way he had stared at the steak with boredom, the way he had complained that the wine wasn't at the perfect temperature. He thought of his bank accounts, the endless rows of zeros that served no one but his own ego. Here, in the shadows of the city he claimed to own, an 11-year-old girl was teaching him the true value of $1, and the devastating math of a heart that gave everything until there was literally nothing left to divide. He looked back through the slats, watching as Lily took a long, slow drink of the water, her throat moving as she tried to trick her stomach into believing it was full, her eyes never leaving her family, watching over them like a silent, starving guardian. The silence of the warehouse was suddenly punctuated by the sharp, hollow crack of dry wood. Ronald had shifted his weight, his foot catching a loose splinter on the pallet, and in the cavernous room, the sound echoed like a gunshot. The effect was instantaneous. The soft murmurs of the children vanished, replaced by a terrifying absolute stillness. Lily didn't scream, she didn't run, she stood up with a fluid defensive grace, a small body stepping directly between the flickering fire and the shadows where Ronald was hidden. Her hand went instinctively to the pocket where she kept the small folding knife, her eyes narrowing as they searched the darkness. "Who's there?" she demanded. Her voice didn't shake, but it was edged with a desperate, animal sharpness. The younger children scrambled backward, huddled together in a tangle of blankets, their eyes wide and reflecting the orange flames like frightened forest creatures. Ronald knew he couldn't stay hidden any longer. The weight of his own intrusion felt like a physical burden as he stepped out from behind the wall of pallets. As he entered the dim circle of light, the visual disparity was jarring. The expensive navy blue wool of his suit, now smudged with warehouse grime, looked alien against the backdrop of rusted steel and rot. Lily's breath hitched. She recognized him immediately, but the gratitude he was used to seeing on the sidewalk was gone, replaced by a cold, paralyzing terror. "Mr. Newsome," she whispered, her face turning a ghostly shade of gray in the firelight. She glanced down at the white bistro containers on the floor, then back at him, her chest heaving. Please, sir, I'll give it back. I didn't steal it. You gave it to me. I'll give it all back. Just don't call them." Ronald took a step forward, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. But Lily recoiled, her heels catching on the concrete. "I'm not calling anyone, Lily," he said, his voice struggling to remain steady. But the girl wasn't listening. She was spiraling into a panic born of years of hiding from the world. "We're leaving, I promise," she stammered, her words coming in a frantic rush as she began to grab at the children's blankets. "We won't be here tomorrow. We don't cause any trouble. Please don't tell the police. If they see us here, they'll take the little ones. They'll put us in different places. They'll break us up. I'll pay for the food. I have $3.60 in my bag. Just please, don't take them away." The sight of her, an 11-year-old child,
offering her meager life savings to a billionaire to prevent the destruction of her family, was the final blow to Ronald's armor. He saw the way the younger children clung to her coat, looking at him as if he were a monster sent to drag them into the night. To them, he wasn't a successful businessman. He was the embodiment of the system that wanted to erase them. "Lily, stop," Ronald said, and this time his voice carried a raw human vibration that stopped her mid-motion. He knelt down on the cold concrete, heedless of the damage to his trousers, bringing himself level with her eyeline. "I didn't follow you to take anything back, and I'm not here to call the police." Lily froze, her hand still white-knuckled around the handle of a plastic bag. She searched his face, her large, weary eyes looking for the lie, for the corporate trap she expected. "Then why?" she asked, her voice small and trembling. "Why did you follow me all the way here?" Ronald looked at the slivers of steak on the plastic lids, then at the skeletal hands of the girl who had fed everyone but herself. He looked at the vast freezing tomb of a building they called a home. "Because I've spent my whole life looking at numbers and forgetting to look at people," he said honestly, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "I saw you shivering on that sidewalk, and I realized I didn't even know your last name. I didn't know why you were carrying the weight of the world in a plastic bag." He reached out, tentatively, and Lily didn't flinch this time. She stayed still as he looked at the children, then back to her. "You don't have to be afraid of me, Lily. For the first time in 20 years I'm not looking at a bottom line, I'm looking at a hero, and I think it's time someone looked out for the hero too." The tension in Lily's shoulders didn't disappear, it broke. A single heavy tear tracked through the soot on her cheek, followed by another, as the impossible burden of being the only adult in the room finally began to crack under the weight of his words. The warehouse seemed to grow even colder as the adrenaline of the confrontation began to fade, leaving only the stark, shivering reality of their lives. Ronald remained on his knees, his expensive suit absorbing the dampness of the concrete, while Lily slowly lowered herself onto a rusted crate. The younger children, sensing the shift in energy, crawled back toward her, seeking the warmth of her presence, like iron filings, drawn to a magnet. The fire crackled, a small defiant spark in the vast industrial gloom, casting long shadows that danced against the peeling brick walls. "Where is your mother, Lily?" Ronald asked, his voice barely a murmur. He expected to hear a story of abandonment, or a tragedy involving the state, but the silence that followed was heavier than any answer. Lily looked into the embers, her face hardening into a mask of grief that was far too old for her features. "She's gone," she whispered. 3 months ago. It was the winter. The cough just wouldn't stop. She worked at the laundry until she couldn't stand up anymore. One morning, she just didn't wake up. The girl's voice didn't break. It was flat, as if she had told the story to herself 1,000 times, just to make it real. "We didn't tell anyone. We couldn't. If the school found out, or the neighbors, they would have called the people in the van. They would have taken Elijah to one house, and Sophia to another. We promised her we'd stay together. We promised we wouldn't let them break the chain." Ronald felt a physical ache in his chest, a sharp twisting sensation he hadn't experienced since he was a child himself. He looked at the row of small, expectant faces. They were living in a tomb of silence, hiding the death of their mother to preserve the life of their family. This 11-year-old girl had been carrying a secret that would have crushed a seasoned executive, managing a household of 7 in an abandoned warehouse, while mourning the only person who had ever loved them. "I took her job," Lily continued, her eyes finally meeting Ronald's, with a fierce, defiant pride. "I told the laundry manager I was 16. I wear the big coat and keep my head down. I work the early shift, then I go to school, then I collect the bottles, and then I wait for you." She looked down at her hands, the skeletal, red raw skin that Ronald had noticed at the bistro. The leftovers were the only thing that kept the little ones from getting sick. "Your steak, that was the only meat they had all month. I didn't care if I was hungry. I just needed them to be strong enough to keep hiding." The sheer scale of her sacrifice hit Ronald with the force of a tidal wave. He thought of his boardroom, where sacrifice meant taking a smaller bonus, or staying together meant a corporate merger. He realized that for all his billions he was the poorest person in the room, He had no one who would starve for him, no one he would protect with such desperate, beautiful ferocity. His wealth was a hollow tower of glass, while Lily's poverty was a fortress of love. "You can't keep doing this, Lily," Ronald said, his voice thick with emotion. "The winter is coming. This building, it's not a home, it's a refrigerator." Lily stood up again, her jaw tightening as that familiar shadow of terror returned to her eyes. "We're staying together," she said, her voice rising in a sharp, protective spike. "I don't care how cold it gets. I'll work more hours. I'll find more food. You said you wouldn't call them. I did promise," Ronald said, standing up and reaching for his phone, his fingers moving with a new frantic urgency. "But I'm not calling the state, Lily. I'm calling my life's work into question." He looked at the screen of his phone, the stocks, the trades, the notifications of a world that no longer made sense. He realized he had been an architect of a city that allowed children to hide in the dark to stay loved. In that moment, the bottom line that had governed Ronald Newsom's life for 40 years shattered. He wasn't thinking about assets or liabilities anymore. He was thinking about a house with a fireplace. He was thinking about a doctor who wouldn't ask for a social security number. He was thinking about a table where no one had to do the math of hunger. He looked at Lily, the small girl in the oversized olive coat, who had broken him open, and for the first time in his life, Ronald Newsom felt like a man who truly had something to. He hit the dial for his private assistant, his voice firm and clear. "Cancel everything for the next month. I need you to find a property, a large house, secluded, with a garden, and I need a private medical team on standby." The transition from the cold, echoing warehouse to the warmth of the Newsom sanctuary did not happen with a single check, but with a series of deliberate, quiet acts of restoration. Ronald Newsom did not just buy the property. He bought the silence and the safety that Lily had spent months dying to protect. Within 48 hours, the cavernous industrial ruin was no longer a tomb of secret. Ronald had leveraged his entire corporate infrastructure, not to move stocks, but to move lives. He purchased an expansive estate on the outskirts of the city, a place of stone and cedar, nestled among ancient oaks, where the only sound was the wind in the leaves, rather than the roar of a hungry city. The transformation was most visible in the children. On the first night at the estate, Ronald sat at the head of a long oak dining table that glowed under the light of a real chandelier. There was no math here. There were no slivers of meat or divided crusts of bread. Platters of roasted chicken, bowls of steaming potatoes, and fresh fruit were laid out in a bounty that seemed to overwhelm the younger children. They sat in plush, high-backed chairs, their small frames draped in soft, new sweaters, looking at the food as if it were a dream they might wake from at any second. Lily sat to Ronald's right. She had finally taken off the oversized olive jacket, revealing how fragile her shoulders truly were, though her eyes remained the watchful sentinels of the group. Ronald watched as Lily reached for a piece of bread, her hand hovering over the basket. She didn't take the largest piece, and she didn't look at her own plate first. She looked at Elijah, then Sophia, then the toddlers, ensuring they had all begun to eat before she allowed herself a single bite. Ronald felt a lump form in his throat that no amount of expensive wine could wash away. He realized then that while he had provided the house, Lily had provided the soul. He wasn't just their benefactor. He was their student. She was teaching him that wealth was not an accumulation of things, but a distribution of care. In the weeks that followed, the Newsom sanctuary became more than a house. Ronald established a foundation in the name of their mother, a fund dedicated to ensuring that no child in the city would ever have to choose between their family and their survival. He hired a private tutor for the children and a medical team to oversee their recovery from the months of neglect. But his most significant move was his own presence. The billionaire, who used to spend 18 hours a day in a sterile office, now found himself reading stories by the fireplace, or teaching Elijah how to play chess. The corporate world whispered about his eccentricity and his withdrawal from the market, but Ronald had never felt more invested in his life. He was finally trading in a currency that didn't devalue with a market crash. One evening, as the first real snow of the season began to fall, coating the gardens in a pristine, silent white, Lily found Ronald in the library. She was wearing a simple, warm dress, her hair neatly brushed, the hollows in her cheeks finally beginning to fill with the glow of health. She didn't say anything at first. She simply stood by the window, watching the flakes drift down. Ronald looked at her, seeing no longer the leftover girl in the tan beanie, but a young woman whose strength had saved 6 lives and reclaimed his own. "You don't have to wait outside anymore, Lily," Ronald said softly, his voice echoing with a warmth he hadn't known he possessed. Lily turned to him, a small genuine smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. The first real smile Ronald had ever seen from her. "I know," she whispered. "For the first time, I don't feel like I'm carrying the bags. I feel like I'm finally home." Ronald stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the estate he had once viewed as just another asset. He realized that the greatest deal he had ever closed wasn't the acquisition of a company or a rise in dividends. It was the moment he stepped out of his limousine and followed a child into the dark. He had set out to save her family, but in the end the girl with the leftovers had saved him from a life of gilded isolation. As they stood together watching the snow, the billionaire and the girl, the math was finally simple. They were no longer divided and they were no longer alone.